My den smelled of ozone and defeat. The heavy steel door of my gun safe stood open, a silent, gaping mouth. My grandson Leo gestured to the empty racks, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's done," he said to his lawyer, his voice dripping with condescending victory. "All 10 of them. That's a clean $50,000, and the old man can't prove a thing." The number hung in the air, cold and sharp. He had appraised my life's collection like a side of beef. Leo let out a short, cruel laugh. What's he gonna do now? Call the History Channel? His lawyer, a man whose suit cost more than my first car, chuckled along with him. The sound was thin and metallic in the quiet room. My own son Mark stood by the window, unable to meet my eyes. The situation felt absolute, a final nail in a coffin I hadn't realized they were building for me. They believed it was over. They believed they had won everything. The lawyer slid a document across my desk. "As you can see, Mr. Richter, without evidence of forced entry, it's a family dispute, a civil matter. Leo has already sold the items. It's his word against yours. And frankly, at your age," he left the insult hanging. The paper was a settlement offer. $5,000 for my silence. A pittance meant to humiliate me, to purchase my dignity for pennies on the dollar. The sum was a final twist of the knife. I didn't look at the paper. I remained in my worn leather armchair, my hands folded calmly in my lap. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound I focused on. I met Leo's triumphant gaze, and I allowed the corner of my mouth to lift in a faint smile. He mistook it for senility, for the vacant expression of the defeated. He couldn't see the gears turning, the cold, hard machinery of a plan that had been clicking into place for weeks. Leo's smirk faltered. My silence was unnerving him. The lawyer cleared his throat, impatient. "Mr. Richter?" My son shifted his weight, a portrait of weak-willed guilt. I slowly raised a single, arthrited finger, commanding the room's attention. The air grew thick with anticipation. I parted my lips to speak, to bring their world crashing down. But months earlier, it all began on a quiet Sunday evening, around 7 p.m., with a single empty space where a memory should have been. The house was always quiet after Ingrid passed. The silence had a weight to it, broken only by the ticking grandfather clock in the hall and the hum of the refrigerator. I kept it meticulously clean, just as she had. On that Sunday, I decided to perform my monthly ritual, cleaning and oiling my collection. It wasn't about the function of the firearms. It was about history, about preservation. Each piece told the story, my story, and caring for them was like tending to the memories themselves. I dialed the combination, the familiar clicks echoing in the den. The heavy door swung open, revealing the felt-lined interior, the faint, pleasant smell of gun oil and aged wood. My eyes scanned the racks, Colt, Winchester, Browning, and then a hollow. A deep, jarring emptiness on the top rack. My M1 Garand, the rifle I'd carried through the Ardennes, the one I'd qualified with at 18, it was gone, not moved, not shifted. Gone. A cold fist clenched in my gut. My first thought was that I'd misplaced it. A foolish notion for a man who could account for every screw in his workshop. I checked my logbook, a leather-bound journal where I recorded every cleaning, every loan to a museum, every repair. The last entry for the Garand was 3 weeks prior, cleaned and oiled, condition excellent. It hadn't left the house. It hadn't left that safe. The cold dread began to curdle into a suspicion I didn't want to face. Leo stopped by the next afternoon. He needed to borrow $50 again. He slumped onto the sofa, scrolling through his phone while I made coffee. "Grandpa, you have all this stuff," he said, waving a hand vaguely around the room. "Old things. You should sell some of it, live a whittle." His eyes were restless, darting around, never quite settling on me. The casual entitlement in his voice set my teeth on edge. He saw history as a price tag. I kept my voice even. "Leo, have you been in my den lately? I can't seem to find my old Garand." His head snapped up. "What? No, why would I go in there?" The denial was too fast, too sharp. He couldn't look me in the eye. He immediately changed the subject back to his money problems, his car payment, his phone bill. He was building a wall of mundane complaints to hide behind, but I could see the lie in the frantic energy of his words. Later that week, I overheard him talking to his father on the phone. "It's a waste, Dad." Leo's voice whined, thin and reedy through the receiver. "He never shoots them. They're just sitting there, collecting dust. It's like a museum nobody goes to. That money could actually be used for something." My own son's placating response was what truly twisted the knife. "I know, son. I know. Just be patient." They weren't just taking things. They were justifying it. The memory stung. I remembered teaching a 10-year-old Leo about firearm safety. We were in this very den. I had placed the unloaded Garand in his small hands, showing him the weight of it, the history. "This isn't a toy, Leo," I had told him. "It's a responsibility. You respect it." He had looked at me with wide, earnest eyes and nodded. That boy was gone, replaced by a greedy stranger who saw respect as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The next Sunday, I checked the safe again. Now the Colt 1911 that had been my father's was missing too. The thief was growing bolder. I knew it was Leo. He was the only other person who knew the combination, a number I'd given him years ago in case of emergency. An act of trust. He was dismantling my life, piece by piece, and using my trust as his key. The betrayal, with no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty, cold and hard as the steel of the empty gun rack. I needed proof, something tangible. I started quietly searching. In the small trash bin in his old bedroom, which he still used when he stayed over, I found it. A crumpled receipt, a pawn slip from a shop downtown. The description was vague, vintage rifle, but the date was 2 days after my Garand went missing. The payout was a pathetic $400. He had sold a piece of my soul, a relic of American history, for the price of a new video game console. I knew confronting him, or my son, with this flimsy proof would be useless. They would call me crazy, accuse me of snooping. I needed something more. I was looking for insurance paperwork in my old roll-top desk when my hand brushed against the small, locked metal box. It had been my wife Ingrid's, where she kept important odds and ends. Leo had seen it 100 times, always dismissing it as Grandma's junk box. I turned the small key and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in worn oilcloth, was the Luger P08, a trophy I'd brought back from the war, taken from a surrendering German officer. It wasn't part of my official registered collection. It was a ghost, a personal memento. Its blued steel felt cold and heavy in my hand. Beneath it lay a stack of documents I hadn't looked at in 50 years. The original military capture papers, properly stamped and signed. Proof of provenance, proof of ownership. They were my secret. Leo walked in as I was holding it. "Whoa, a Nazi gun?" he said with a snort. "Cool. Is it worth anything?" I told him it was just an old war souvenir. "Probably not even registered," he scoffed. "You should get rid of it. It's just junk, Grandpa. Probably couldn't get more than $100 for it." He waved it off, his eyes already scanning the room for things of more obvious value. He had no idea what he was looking at. He saw an old pistol. I saw leverage. I decided I had to try the direct route first. I called a family meeting. Myself, my son Mark, and Leo. I laid out the facts calmly. The missing Garand, the missing Colt. I didn't mention the pawn slip yet. I just looked at Leo and asked for the truth. "Grandpa, I can't believe this," he said, his voice cracking with false emotion. "You think I would steal from you?" He turned to his father, playing the wounded victim perfectly. Mark, my own son, fell for it completely. "Dad, this has to stop," he said, his tone a mixture of pity and frustration. "Your memory isn't what it used to be. Are you sure you didn't just sell them and forget? Accusing your grandson is a terrible thing." In their eyes, I was no longer a father or a soldier. I was a confused old man, a burden. That public humiliation, right there in my own living room, was worse than the theft itself. They left soon after, leaving me in a silence that felt heavier than before. They were a united front, convinced of my decline. They had created a narrative that protected Leo and painted me as the villain, or worse, as irrelevant. I sat in my chair for a long time, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. The fight wasn't just about the guns anymore. It was about my name, my sanity, and the last vestiges of my authority in my own family. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was standing by the open window when I heard Leo's car pull up outside. He was on his phone, his voice loud and arrogant in the still night air. Yeah, man, it was easy. He bought the whole forgetful old man act. I reckon I can clear out the whole safe in another month. It's a gold mine. A gold mine. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was mining my life, my history, and gloating about it. Hearing those words, that casual, brutal confirmation changed everything. The hurt solidified into something cold and hard. There would be no more family meetings, no more appeals to a conscience that didn't exist. My path was clear. This would not be a family squabble. This would be a war, fought on my terms, with weapons they didn't even know I possessed. The first step was to let him think he was winning. I had to let him empty the safe. Over the next few weeks, I feigned ignorance. I played the part they'd cast for me. I acted more forgetful. Asked my son if he'd seen my keys when they were in my hand. All the while, I watched as one by one, my prized firearms vanished. The Winchester 1897, the Browning Auto 5. Each disappearance was a precise, painful cut. I kept a silent, meticulous log, noting the date each one was taken. And I waited for him to take them all. I found more pawn slips. He wasn't even trying to hide them anymore, weaving them in his jacket pocket in the hall closet. 4 different shops across the city. He was spreading them out, thinking he was clever. Each slip was a nail for his coffin. But I learned something crucial. Pawn shops are required by law to hold items for a specific period before they can sell them. In this state, it was 30 days. The 30-day police hold on the conned items expiring. The clock was ticking. The hardest part was the waiting. Every day felt like a year. I'd walk into the den and see the growing emptiness in the safe, and a wave of despair would wash over me. I had to fight it down, had to focus on the plan. I took the capture papers for the Luger, along with my own military service records and the original purchase receipts for every single firearm in my collection, and made 3 certified copies. 1 for me, 1 for my lawyer, and 1 for what was to come. I hired a lawyer, a young woman named Ms. Alvarez, who specialized in elder law. I didn't tell her the whole plan, just that I needed to document the theft of my property. She was sharp, but skeptical. Mr. Richter, without your family's cooperation, this is an uphill battle. They're claiming you gifted the items to Leo. She presented me with the very real possibility of failure. That was my first moment of true hope, a clear target to fight against. The next blow came from the police. I filed a report, providing a list of the missing firearms and their serial numbers. The officer who came to my house was polite, but dismissive. Honestly, sir, with no forced entry, and your grandson being the only other person with a combination, it's a he said, she said. We can file it, but I wouldn't expect much. It felt like being locked in a room where every door was designed to look like an exit, but was actually a wall. My son, Mark, called me a week later, his voice filled with a righteous anger that was entirely manufactured. Dad, I got a call from the police. You reported Leo for theft. After what we talked about, you're tearing his family apart over some old guns. The accusation stung more than any theft. To him, my legacy was just some old guns, and my desire for justice was a selfish act of destruction. The betrayal was now complete. He was a willing accomplice. Miss Alvarez called with grim news. Leo, coached by his own lawyer, had produced a handwritten note. It said, "To Leo, for all your help, use these as you need, Grandpa." My signature was forged, but it was a decent forgery, good enough to muddy the waters. This turns it from a clear theft into a contested gift, she explained. He's claiming you gave them to him and are now having seller's remorse. It's a classic defense against the elderly. My hope of a simple legal remedy was shattered. I was at my lowest point. The safe was nearly empty. My family was aligned against me, and the legal system seemed designed to fail me. I sat in my den, the open safe door like a tombstone. I opened Ingrid's small metal box again. The Luger was still there, cold and inert. It felt like a symbol of my helplessness, a secret I could tell no one, a piece of the past that was as powerless as I was, a bitter memory of a time when I had authority, when my word meant something. I picked up the capture papers again, my fingers tracing the faded German ink in the crisp American stamps. That's when I saw it, tucked into the folds of the oilcloth, something I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a military document. It was a separate, smaller slip of paper, brittle with age. A U.S. Customs form from 1945, declaring the firearm upon my return to the United States. And on it, a stamp, federally registered war trophy. Non-transferable without ATF approval. My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in the quiet room. Non-transferable. Not part of my collection for sale, not a gift to be given. It was a controlled historical artifact. I suddenly remembered the officer at the port in Boston, a stern man who would explain the law with bureaucratic precision. This pistol is yours, Sergeant, but it belongs to history too. The government will always know where it is. The forgotten words, dormant for over 70 years, now bloomed with devastating potential. The entire legal landscape had just shifted. This wasn't about a family dispute over property anymore. This was federal. Selling a firearm to a pawn shop is a legal transfer that requires paperwork. Pawning a stolen firearm is a state crime. But pawning a stolen, federally registered, non-transferable war trophy? That was a felony that invited the attention of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Leo hadn't just stolen from his grandpa, he had broken federal law. The pawn slips were no longer just proof of theft. They were Leo's signed confessions. Each slip had his name, his driver's license number, his signature, and the fingerprint. And on each slip was the serial number of one of my firearms. By pawning them, he created a paper trail directly to himself. When the ATF flagged those numbers as stolen, every single transaction would become a separate federal offense. The pawn shops would be legally compelled to return my property. I didn't call Miss Alvarez. Not yet. This was my move to make. I went to the local ATF field office, a stark, imposing building downtown. I brought my folder with the certified copies of everything, my service record, the original purchase receipts for every gun, the customs form for the Luger, and the pawn slips. I was calm, my hands steady. I was no longer a victim. I was a veteran with a report to file. I sat across from a field agent named Carter. He was young, professional, and listened without interruption as I laid out the documents, one by one. His eyes narrowed with interest when he saw the original receipts with serial numbers. But when I placed the 1945 customs form on the table, he stopped. He picked it up carefully, as if it might crumble. "Well, he said softly, looking up at me with newfound respect. "You don't see these every day." I explained my plan. I would report the entire collection as stolen, with the Luger being the final missing piece. "My grandson thinks it's a worthless piece of junk," I told him. "He'll take it last. When he pawns it, you'll have him." Agent Carter leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Richter, selling a firearm across state lines without a federal license is illegal. Many of these pawn shops sell online. This is bigger than you think." The next step was to set the bait. I needed Leo to steal the Luger. I left Ingrid's box on my desk, slightly ajar. I made a show of leaving the house for a few hours, telling Mark I had a doctor's appointment. I knew he would call Leo. The trap was now set. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty, but charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The hum of the refrigerator was a low, steady countdown. When I returned, the box was closed. I opened it. The oilcloth was empty. A profound, icy calm washed over me. He had taken it. He had taken the last piece. He had walked right into the snare I'd laid for him, blinded by his own greed and his contempt for me. He thought he was stealing the final, worthless scrap from a helpless old man. He had no idea he had just stolen the evidence that would seal his fate. The very next day, I called Leo. I made my voice sound frail, defeated. Leo, I said, I give up. You win. Come over with your father. We'll sign whatever papers your lawyer wants. I could almost hear the smug smile in his voice. Sure, Grandpa. We'll be there this evening. Glad you're finally seeing reason. He thought it was his victory party. He didn't know it was an invitation to his own execution. While I waited, Agent Carter called. We have it, he said, his voice clipped and professional. He pawned it not even an hour after you left the house yesterday. Got $200 for it. The shop owner scanned the serial number and it lit up our system like a Christmas tree. We have agents on their way to every pawn shop on your list. We'll be securing your property as evidence. The gears of federal justice were grinding, and they were grinding for me. I remembered Ingrid then, just for a moment. I remembered her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in doing the right thing, no matter how hard. She never liked the guns, but she understood what they meant to me. She kept the Luger and its papers in her box because she knew it was different, that it was a part of my history I couldn't part with. Her foresight, her quiet act of preservation, had become my salvation. It was a final gift from her. My son and grandson arrived at 7 p.m., just as the last light of day was fading. Leo was practically bouncing with arrogance, his lawyer in tow. They strode into my den, the scene of their initial triumph, ready to finalize my surrender. Glad you're not going to be difficult about this, Dad, Mark said, still avoiding my eyes. He was a man drowning in weakness, clinging to his son's monstrous ego as a life raft. The lawyer laid the settlement agreement on the desk again. Just sign here, Mr. Richter, he said smoothly. $5,000, and you agree to cease all claims and accusations. Leo leaned against the empty gun safe, arms crossed, a triumphant smear on his face. This was his final insult, the moment he would savor, watching me sign away my rights, my dignity, my history, for a pittance. He was so sure he had won. And so we returned to that moment. My den, smelling of ozone and defeat. Their defeat, not mine. The open safe, the smug faces, the insulting document on my desk. They were all waiting for my signature, for the final act of my humiliation. I let the silence stretch, savoring the panic that was beginning to flicker in Leo's eyes. He didn't understand my calm. He thought it was the last flicker of a dying fire, not the steady burn of a furnace. I finally picked up the pen, but I didn't sign the document. Instead, I turned it over and wrote down a series of numbers on the blank back. The serial numbers of the Garand, the Colt, the Browning, the Winchester, and finally, the Luger. I slid the paper back across the desk. These might be of interest to you, I said, my voice as level as a rifle sight. They are now part of a federal investigation. Leo's lawyer scoffed. A federal investigation? Don't be ridiculous. This is a civil matter. Just then, 2 sets of headlights swept across the living room window, followed by the solid, authoritative thud of car doors closing. Footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway. Heavy, purposeful footsteps. Leo's face went pale. Who is that? He stammered, his arrogance evaporating like mist. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. I didn't move. I just looked at Leo. That would be Agent Carter and his colleagues from the ATF, I said calmly. They have a warrant for your arrest, Leo, for the illegal sale and transport of stolen firearms, including a federally registered war trophy. It seems that old piece of junk was worth more than you thought. The color drained completely from his face. My son Mark looked from me to Leo, his expression one of dawning, horrified comprehension. Agent Carter and another man entered the room. They didn't look at me. Their focus was entirely on Leo. Leo Richter? Carter asked, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. You're under arrest. He recited the charges, each word a hammer blow dismantling Leo's world. The lawyer stood speechless, his $5,000 suit suddenly looking cheap and useless. My son finally looked at me, his eyes pleading, but he found no comfort in my gaze. There was none left to give. As they put Leo in handcuffs, he looked at me, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. You did this, he spat. Your own grandson, over some stupid rusty guns. He still didn't understand. He never would. It wasn't about the guns. It was about the casual cruelty, the absolute lack of respect, the belief that my life's value was his to liquidate. He had underestimated the quiet old man in the chair. Everyone had. The agents led a sputtering, protesting Leo out of the house. His lawyer, flustered and impotent, followed them, stammering about civil rights. My son, Mark, collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. "Dad, what did you do?" he whispered. The accusation was gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate fear. He wasn't worried about me or about justice. He was worried about the shame, about the inconvenience, about how this would affect him. Agent Carter came back into the room, holding a folder. "Mr. Richter," he said, his tone formal, but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. "We have recovered all 10 pieces. They are currently impounded as evidence. Once the legal proceedings are concluded, we will have them returned to you." The pawn shops were very cooperative once they saw the federal warrant. The quiet efficiency of it all was more satisfying than any shouting match could ever be. It was the sound of a well-oiled machine doing its job. He handed me a document. It wasn't a settlement offer. It was a court order. A temporary restraining order forbidding Leo and his father from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property. And another document, a receipt for the impounded firearms, my property, now held safely under the protection of the U.S. government. These papers weren't meant to humiliate. They were meant to protect. They were a shield where the others had offered a sword. My son looked up, his face ashen. "Dad, please. He's your grandson. You can't let this happen. There must be another way. Call them back. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." He still believed this was a negotiation. He didn't grasp the finality of it. "The time for another way is over, Mark," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "You both made sure of that. You chose a side. Now you must live with it." He talked about lawyers, about family, about what people would say. He didn't once apologize. He didn't once acknowledge the theft, the lies, the campaign of gaslighting they had waged against me. His only concern was managing the fallout. He saw my actions not as a quest for justice, but as a social embarrassment he would have to endure. His weakness, I realized, was a deeper betrayal than Leo's greed. Leo was a wolf. My son had let the wolf into the fold. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between us. It had been the soundtrack to my quiet desperation and then to my cold planning. Now it sounded different, triumphant, a steady, unwavering thrum of normalcy being restored. The house was quiet again, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the heavy, oppressive silence of loss. It was my house again. The air felt cleaner, lighter. The oppressive weight had lifted. The legal battle that followed was brief and one-sided. The evidence was overwhelming. The pawn slits, the federal registration of the Luger, Leo's own recorded phone call, which a neighbor, tired of his late-night noise, had inadvertently captured on a security camera and provided to the ATF. Leo's lawyer quickly negotiated a plea deal. He faced serious time. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen terror. I attended the sentencing, not for revenge, but for closure. The arena was a sterile, impersonal courtroom, a public stage just like my den had been. Leo stood before the judge, a boy in an ill-fitting suit, stripped of all his swagger. He was sentenced to 18 months in a federal penitentiary and ordered to pay full restitution, not the pathetic sum he'd received, but the appraised value of the collection. $50,000. My son had to take out a second mortgage on his house to cover the restitution and Leo's legal fees. He never spoke to me again after that day in court. Our relationship had been another casualty of Leo's greed, but it was a structure that had been rotting from the inside for years. I felt a quiet sadness for the son I once knew, but no regret for the man he had become. Some things once broken cannot be repaired. Months later, 2 men from the ATF delivered my collection. They carried the heavy wooden crates into my den with a reverence that surprised me. They helped me unbox each piece, checking it against their inventory. The Garand, the Colt, the Winchesters, they were all there, their steel and wood gleaming under the light. They were home. My history was home. They were no longer just some old guns. They were symbols of a victory won. The last piece they brought in was the Luger. Agent Carter, who had come to oversee the return, handed it to me himself. "This started it all," he said with a nod of respect. I took the pistol. It felt different now. Not a symbol of loss, but of quiet strength. A ghost from the past that had reached across 70 years to deliver a final, decisive blow for justice. I secured it back in Ingrid's box, its duty done. I spent that evening cleaning and oiling each firearm, the familiar, meditative ritual a balm to my soul. The scent of gun oil filled the den, but this time it was a smell of restoration, not of impending loss. I updated my logbook, each entry a testament to survival. The house was quiet, but it was a contented silence. The ghosts of betrayal had been exorcised. The space they had occupied was now filled with peace. A week later, I received a call from a local museum of military history. Agent Carter had told them about my collection and its unique story. They asked if I would consider loaning some of the pieces for a special exhibit on veterans' histories. They weren't interested in their monetary value. They were interested in their stories. My story. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I agreed, but on one condition. The display had to include a small plaque for the Luger, which would remain with me. The plaque would not mention its monetary value. It would simply say, "Property of Gunther Richter," a reminder that some things are not for sale, and that true value is measured not in dollars, but in respect. They were happy to oblige. The victory wasn't just private. It would now be a public lesson. I walked through the exhibit on the opening day. I saw my Garand behind glass, a small card detailing its service in the Battle of the Bulge. Children looked at it with a sense of awe, the same awe a young Leo once had. But this was different. This respect was earned, protected, and now shared. Leo had wanted to turn my history into cash. Instead, I had turned it into a lesson for a generation he would never understand. My life found a new rhythm. I volunteered at the museum twice a week, telling my stories to visitors. The quiet old man my family had dismissed found his voice again. I spoke of the war, of duty, of the importance of remembering. I never spoke of Leo or my son. They were a chapter of my life that was over, a story that had reached its conclusion. My focus was on the future, on the histories I can preserve. One afternoon, a young girl, no older than 10, asked me about the empty space in the display where the Luger was mentioned. "Why isn't it here?" she asked. I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw the earnest face of my grandson from long ago. "Because," I said gently, "its job is done. It's home, resting." She nodded, understanding perfectly. Some things don't need to be seen to be powerful. The house is no longer silent. It's filled with the low murmur of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the enthusiastic chatter of museum curators on the phone. The gun safe is no longer a tomb but a library, with pieces occasionally checked out, their stories shared with the world. It is a living history, not a dusty collection waiting to be plundered. It is a legacy, not an asset. I sit in my den, the evening light filtering through the window. Ingrid's box is on the desk beside me, closed. I don't need to open it. I know what's inside. It's not a weapon. It's a key, a testament, a promise I made to myself to never again be underestimated, to never again let my silence be mistaken for weakness. The past is not something to be sold. It is something to be wielded. The phone rings. It's Ms. Alvarez, confirming the final restitution payment has cleared. I thank her for her help. I hang up the phone, the click of the receiver final and absolute. I rise from my chair, walk over to the den window, and look out at the quiet street. The world continues, indifferent. But here, in this small, meticulously clean house, justice has been served. I pick up my logbook and make the final entry, then close the cover.